Welcome to this edition of Speaking of Settlements. I'm Scott Drake, and today my guests are with ForStructures.com, John Derer. John, welcome.
Thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you today.
And the president of Wallstrom and Associates, Mark Wallstrom. Mark?
Thanks, Scott. It's good to be here.
All right, today we're talking about the Executive Life of New York issue. John, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us an update?
Well, let's start off with a little bit of a historical perspective, because not every one of our viewers knows who Executive Life is, and maybe some people in our industry don't even know. Basically, Executive Life of New York was a New York life insurance company that wrote it was a subsidiary of Executive Life Insurance Company of California that wrote a lot of annuity business back in the 80s and early 90s until it was taken over and went into rehabilitation by the New York State Insurance Department, and that was in April of 1992. The issue regarding Executive Life was they sold, and as far as structured settlements are concerned, they sold structured settlements at incredibly great prices, and those incredibly great prices were based on the fact that their portfolio was filled with a lot of junk bonds. So back, those of you who remember the 1980s, there was a period of very high inflation, and we had an anomaly of interest rates where we had interest rates in the teens. So what was happening is they were discounting back these liabilities using these high interest rate investments, which is fine for the duration of the investments. But what ended up happening is sometime in the 2000s, they realized that they were coming to the point where there just wasn't sufficient money or sufficient alternative investments to invest to sustain the projections that were made at the time or that were in the actual annuity contracts. There were a lot of structured settlements sold. It's my understanding that we're over 8,000 sold, and approximately 5,000 people could potentially be affected by what we're going to be discussing. So that's basically the history behind it. Back in 2007 or 2006, they felt that there was going to be a 15-year shortfall, and this is a testimony to the regulators, and this applies to regulators all over the country, but in this case it was the New York regulators. They saw that there was going to be a shortfall, and they went around and assessed other companies and came up with a solution, or were going to assess other companies, and there was going to be a solution, and there was big fanfare about it. And then all of a sudden we find out, it leaks out that in fact, because of the financial crisis, that is not the case, and that recently there was an order of liquidation. There's some notices that have gone out very quietly, and there may not be a happy ending to this story. There may be a happy ending to this story, but there may not be a happy ending to this story, and that's why we felt that it was important to bring this to our viewers and listeners.
All right, Mark, I'll go to you now. Given the historical perspective, where do we find ourselves now? Why does this keep re-emerging in the news?
Well, Scott, I mean, the reason that we run into this, as John was pointing out, is because the initial underlying assets with Executive Life of New York were never sufficient. They were never adequate because of the nature of the assets. They were junk bonds. Many of them went into liquidation. Many of them were sold during the last time that Executive Life of New York went into liquidation. And the problem that we have is that when this all came about in the late 80s and early 90s, is that we had a period of time where regulators in other states essentially caused a panic, caused a lot of assets to be sold. And the problem is we had promises made that assumed interest rates, as John was saying, in the teens, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15%. But an even more serious problem is they use very aggressive medical underwriting for age ratings to assume that these people would die sooner than they are actually dying, improvements in mortality. So we have almost a perfect storm of bad assets, unrealistic and overly aggressive medical underwriting. As John was saying, that this great fanfare that there had been a solution made in 2006, when in fact now the assumptions again have failed because we went through the financial meltdown and crisis. Interest rates have dropped to near zero. Real estate has collapsed. The stock market, did its huge roller coaster dip and back. But at the end of the day, what happens on these obligations and these contracts is that every single day that goes by, it gets more and more expensive to come up with a solution because you're closer to the day in which many of these payments have to be made.
John, give us an example of a typical structured settlement contract. Why is it more expensive to fix this problem?
Well, let's say you're dealing with, you have a medical malpractice situation involving a brain-damaged infant. So the infant typically would need a stream of income to pay for medical expenses, and back in the day they would be writing these, because the discount rates were so high, they would write these massive lump sum payments stretching out until the child was age 60. So you could start off with somebody who is, say, 6 or 7 years old, and now you're talking about a time horizon that could extend 60 plus years into the future. And these were guaranteed payments. And the problem is, if you just, let's just use, forget about whether they did junk bonds or not, let's just use a completely safe investment like a United States Treasury bond. So if you've got to, in New York State and virtually every other state, you've got to match assets to liabilities. So if they write some business, they've got to go out and buy an asset to match up against those liabilities. Problem is, executive life use junk bonds. But if we go with the treasuries, just as the example, so let's say they were 14%, and the longest that you can get a United States Treasury, at least at the time I recall, was 30 years. So let's say you have an annuity that was a structured settlement annuity that was written in 1989, or let's say 1987, at 11-12%. And it was projecting that 11-12% for 60 years. At the end of the 30-year period, you're now faced with a reinvestment risk, or the reinvestment exposure. And 30 years later, there just were not investments that were 11 or 12%. In fact, there's no investments that are, in terms of those types of investments, that are even close to 11 to 12%. So you have these lump sums that are creeping closer and closer and closer. And so you're not looking at a 30-year time horizon. You might be looking at a 20-year horizon or a 15-year horizon or something even shorter. So back in 2006 or 2007, when during Elliot Spitzer's reign, they came up with all this fanfare that there was a solution. At that point, there was a projected shortfall in 15 years because the regulators were doing their job, or we perceived they were doing their job, and they said, "Hey, you know what? We've got this problem, let's try to solve it." But then the financial crisis happened, and the shortfalls grew even larger.
Mark, with all these shortfalls, time is certainly not on our side. What are the repercussions for the structured settlement brokers and companies with this?
Well, Scott, I really believe in this particular case, this is going to be very difficult for the structured settlement companies, brokers, and for the profession, because this is definitely going to be a black eye on our profession if people don't get their checks, or begin to get partial checks, or have to begin to take reduced payments. And the tragedy on this, and the real problem with this, is that people have, and again, I don't want to say people have been kicking the problem down the road. I think people in 2006 did feel that they had made a serious attempt to solve the problem, and they felt they had a 15-year window. And the meltdown of 2008 and 2009 was a once-in-a-century type event. So there's only certain things that you can do and certain things that you can plan for. But the problem is that early on, you had a lot of people who should have known better, who were selling these contracts, knowing they were backed by junk bonds in such large amounts, because the incentive at that time was to find the lowest cost, because most of the structured settlements at that time were generated by and sold for the benefit of the casualty companies to resolve claims. Now, there's nothing nefarious or evil about that. Their plan really is, and their business purpose is to get a good company to go on the risk with this at the lowest possible cost. The problem is that there needed to be more attention paid to this over the last few years, and when you put it in the hands of regulators and politicians, they're going to do what they've done with a lot of the other crises that we're facing in pension reform and state pensions, municipalities. It's easier for them to kick the problem down the road and have somebody else solve it so that they don't have to take the consequences of the action. So I think what we're going to have here is that there's going to be a crisis moment. There's going to have to be a rallying of, I think, the insurance and the settlement community and the people involved to come up with a serious solution that is clearly presented and communicated to the people that are affected by this, as well as for future clients and people who are invested in the structured settlement profession.
John, a lot of people had assumed that MetLife had absorbed all these. I guess that's not the case.
That's absolutely not the case, and during the course of my career in the settlement industry, I've heard that rumor many times. We actually have a resource page on our blog, which is called Executive Life, What's Going On, and we have a copy of, basically have archived all of the press releases, all of the news stories related to Executive Life back in 1992, so you can see very clearly what actually happened at that time, and we would encourage people in the settlement industry to not make or spread that information because it's inaccurate.
Mark, what are the implications for the industry with this?
Well, Scott, really, we don't want people to panic. We don't want people to feel that the sky is falling on this, but it's something that needs to be discussed. It needs to be out there. We need people to get accurate information, not rumors and not things from the press or from people who certainly don't have the best interest of the structured settlement industry at heart when they go into these things. An awful lot of misinformation comes out whenever headlines like this hit. And what I would tell people, if you have an executive life annuity, make sure you have your paperwork, make sure you have your policy, your contracts, your settlement agreement, anything related to that. And if you don't have it, talk to the attorney. I know a lot of this stuff is a long time ago, but it's easy to Google attorneys and find out where they are now. But go back, begin to do the research now, get your contracts, get your paperwork, get all your stuff in line so you know what's going on your contract, and just be prepared, in the event that there is a shortfall or in the event that there is a situation that you've got your paperwork and documents in order. And again, I think this is going to have to be a collaborative solution between the state of New York, the state insurance commissioners, the insurance industry, and I believe that a solution will hopefully be arrived at on this.
John, finally, how likely could this happen again?
I think it's also important for people to realize that an obvious question that would come to me is, how likely is this situation likely to happen again, especially people who are hear this news and are considering structured settlements today. We had just a complete anomaly in interest rates back in the late 80s, just that period of high inflation. Hopefully we don't get there again, but what really created this phenomenon is that you had this one company that was investing in the worst possible credit, junk bonds, who was making projections over a very long period of time. Now, junk bonds today don't even pay close to what they were paying in the 1980s. So the key thing is, unless we're in an environment where the interest rates are really sky high and you have long-term projections that are going out 50 years, we're not going to run into that. We're unlikely to run into that situation. I think the consensus is that interest rates are likely to rise. So if interest rates were to rise and you had projections, you wouldn't have the same phenomenon. But if we do get into a high interest rate situation where interest rates get into the double digits, I think the proper plan design would be to not put guaranteed lump sums more than a certain number of years into the future where you've got the potential reinvestment risk, especially with some of the smaller companies.
Once again, my guest with forstructures.com is John Darrer. John, thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed being on the show.
And from Wallstrom and Associates, Mark Wallstrom. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure being here.
This is Speaking of Settlements. Thanks for watching.